Government funding, most often provided via contract grants, provides a significant amount of revenue for social purpose organizations. They also come with a significant amount of required administration and reporting. In this module, we will explore the most common forms of government contracts and the infrastructure, administrative capacity, and expenses associated with securing government funds, documenting service provision, and reporting on outcomes.
The goals of this lecture are to review the various forms of government contract structures, and then to spend most of our time highlighting the additional fiscal management and administrative complications that government contracts may trigger. We're going to look at indirect cost rates and how those are calculated, as well as the requirements for an A133 audit or a government audit. We will also spend a bit of time discussing the management benefits and challenges to seeking and maintaining government contracts. Government contracts are a program revenue generator. They provide the organization with funds for providing a specified set of goods or services. Most government contracts are structured either as cost reimbursement or fee for service, with the overwhelming majority being cost reimbursement. And cost reimbursement contracting is similar to seeking a grant proposal in that the organization is required to project out a budget for the delivery of services, and then on a specified schedule may seek reimbursement for apportioned amounts of those expected expenses or for expenses incurred in the delivery of services. But what cost reimbursement really does require an organization to do is to budget very well and project out its total costs over the lifetime of a contract. And sometimes these contracts can be, 3 to 5 years. At various points along the way, you may have the opportunity to do a budget modification, but you really have to think through whether or not the total award available to you will be sufficient to deliver services over a multiple period contract. Fee for service is more of a direct quid pro quo. If you provide housing for X number of people, you are paid for each person. Sometimes there are caps involved, and if you don't hit your numbers, you may receive less in a given period than you had budgeted. It's also important to understand about government contracts that they come from multiple sources, although the most common is the federal government. And so you may receive a direct federal award, which means you are interacting with a federal agency, and they are the beneficiary or the signer of your contract. Or you may be working with a state or local agency that receives federal funds that they are then required to pass through to either smaller municipalities within their jurisdiction or to subcontractors, which are nonprofits often providing the service that is dictated by the terms of the federal program that the states are serving as actors in. Additionally, local governments do generate their own revenue and may interact directly with area nonprofits to provide services to their community members, and those are locally generated and not associated with the federal government. The big thing that you really need to understand about any sort of government contract is the fact that most of them function with allowable indirect cost rates. And an indirect cost rate is a mathematical device that is used, according to the government, to determine fairly and conveniently what portion of indirect costs, so those costs that are not in the direct service of the good or service for which the nonprofit has been enlisted to provide, should be reimbursed to that organization so that they can cover their total costs of operation related to the services they're providing. I kind of tongue-in-cheek included the full name of the organization that both determines and defines indirect cost rates, and it's included at the bottom of the definition and is almost as long as the definition. And I find it kind of amusing to think that any organization that has that many levels in it, and which probably means degrees of administrative overhead to get from the guide to the business operations center, is the one whose mandate is to essentially limit the indirect costs of nonprofits providing services to the federal government or via pass-through to state municipalities. The realities are indirect cost rates have been the subject of much consternation for nonprofits since they've been interacting with governments. In 2013, there was a report that showed that 1 in 4 charities reported that state and local agencies who were passing through federal funds routinely refused to pay indirect costs, even when there was a federally approved indirect rate in place for the agency. Additionally, in 2013, in the same research, we found that almost 50% of nonprofits with government contracts recorded limits of 7% on indirect cost rate. We know that on average, nonprofits carry overhead or administrative rates of 24% or higher, and that those are not organizations that are living an extravagant life, are spending this money on high tea and first class travel accommodations. These are plucky, bootstrapping organizations that have realistic infrastructure, administrative, and operational costs outside of direct service provision that routinely fall above 24% of their total expenses. So when a government contract is forcing a not-for-profit to only be reimbursed for 7% of its indirect cost, that means the organization is actually losing money on providing services under that contract, and that they have to shore up the additional funds to keep the lights on through other sources, whether those sources be individual donations or foundation support. At the end of 2014, the OMB issued rulings that made it illegal and unacceptable for municipal and state governments to disregard a federally approved indirect cost rate. So we've been sort of hopefully seeing a trend. There's been an indication that there is a growing acceptance that operational and administrative costs are an essential part of running a well-managed and sustainable not-for-profit. But whether this plays out over time has yet to be seen. And even though there are federal indirect cost rates that now are supposed to reign supreme, I've worked with many organizations in the last few years who were happy to have federal indirect cost rates of 18 or 22%. Again, these rates are not coming close to capturing the operational realities of not-for-profits. So the big takeaway here is that if you are a not-for-profit organization who is excited about a request for proposals for a government contract, there's a buyer beware or a contractor beware component, and read the fine print. Understand what allowable costs are, understand what the limits of indirect costs are, and make sure that your organization is structured such that it can accurately and adequately track all allowable costs so that you can recapture those costs and bill for them in a timely and efficient manner. So moving away from indirect rates, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to have a federal award. And while the majority of government funds sort of trickle down from the federal government, what it means to get federal funds for a small local nonprofit. Federal awards, as I said, are direct awards from federal agencies, but they may also encompass that pass-through money we've discussed, the money that comes from the federal government but passes through state and city agencies. And it's really important, even though you may on a day-to-day basis only know who your local program officer is or your local administrator is. If you are functioning with federal funds or funds that originated at the federal level, you have to know this and you have to be able to track the amount of expenses your organization has incurred under that federal award. The reason you need to track this is because it triggers a whole new level of audit requirements. And As you would expect, both the federal and state government say it's really up to the nonprofit to know if it's getting federal money or not. So they may not explicitly state in their RFP, they may not regularly remind you where the funds were originating from. So you have to be aware, you have to ask your local agency what is the original source of the funds that they're using for the contract, and you have to look for a CFDA number. All federal awards are assigned a CFDA number, and you can then track back to see which federal agency your funds may have come from, even if they're being awarded by a local or state municipality. So I said you have to be able within your agency to know that you're receiving federal funds and then to track the amount of expenditures of federal fund money. And when I say this, it's not enough to just know under one contract. If you have 4 or 5 government contracts, perhaps with different agencies, you have to know the aggregate expenditure of federal money in your fiscal period so that you can determine whether or not your organization has spent $750,000 of federal money or not. If you spent 700,000, you do not trigger the reporting requirements. If you spent 750,000, you have. And if you have, your organization must now contract with its auditors to produce an A133 audit. And A133 audits are audits with extensive more detail and additional checks on your organization's contract compliance, internal controls, and anti-fraud. An A133 audit is due to the federal government absolutely no longer than 9 months after the close of your fiscal year, and it must be turned over to your federal agency within 30 days of being received from the organization. So if your auditors present to the board and deliver both your GAAP audit and your A133 audit, you have exactly a month to process that audit and turn it over to the government for recording. Doesn't sound so bad if we're doing a GAAP audit anyway. How different could this be? An A133 is a different animal. In addition to tracking and recording all of your financial information, appended to that information is a schedule of expenditures of federal awards, and that means for every government contract you have that has a CFDA number, you have to present the allowable expenditures and have those expenditures verified by an auditor. As your auditor goes through the allowable costs, the unique terms of the conditions of your contract, and any other regulations which may apply to the services you are providing, they may find costs which they question or they throw out. If they do that, then you will have to explain how you misunderstood what was meant by submitting those expenses and what your organization is prepared to do to ensure that those mistakes aren't made again. In addition to that detail of level of tracking your expenditures, A133 audits require that the auditors provide an additional opinion as to your compliance with contract terms and the internal controls you have in place both to ensure compliance and to prevent fraud. As you might imagine, falling subject to an A133 audit can double, if not more, the audit costs for a not-for-profit. What's also important to understand about audit findings in an A133 audit is that the audit firm actually takes responsibility before producing a portion of the audit. Whereas in a GAAP audit, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance around saying everything attached herein is product of management. In an A133 audit, your auditors produce the summary of findings, so any reasons that they had to question or disregard expenditures that you claimed or sought reimbursement for under the contract. They also will document any steps taken by the organization to correct its mistakes if they steps were taken over the course of the fiscal period studied, not necessarily ones that weren't rectified under the period. And then they produce an additional study of things that aren't corrected and that the organization has to respond to. And that response is called the corrective action plan. And so once your auditor produces any of its findings, administration of the organization and the board have to propose steps that they will take to address and cause from repeating any of the mistakes that the audit found in the process. I would say that A133 audits add a level of stress to an agency that is quite significant. I would also say though, once you go through your first A133 audit, things do begin to fall in place and you are able to gain some efficiencies. This is particularly true if you are contracting with the same agency. As you diversify the number of federal sources, if you have multiple agency contracts, those agencies may have different nuances among what they require, what their allowable costs are, and how they want to interact with their contractors. So that can add levels of complication. And you may think because you've been providing a service through one agency for the last 5 years and you've had a wonderful audit process and you pick up a second contract providing almost exactly the same services, but this time financed through a different original federal source. Sometimes that brings with it a bit of a surprise because you are compliant under one contract, but perhaps you missed the nuances of the new agency, and it can muck up your A133 audit. So as you might imagine, it's important to understand that while government contracts represent an enormous source of revenue for the not-for-profit sector, nearly 30% of revenue in the sector comes from government agencies and government contract relationships. But the contracting process is difficult. Reporting and administration of government contracts is excessive. Nonprofit leaders reportedly cite the increasing importance placed on and the costs involved in meeting evaluation requirements, whether or not your organization needs to have an outside evaluator, the process of obtaining and certifying an outside evaluator, and the costs inherent in bringing in trained evaluation professionals to report on both your processes and your impact. Having government contracts significantly complicates your accounting and bookkeeping and can increase accounting and auditing requirements. We still find that government organizations are sometimes slow to make payments. And for everyone working on a cost reimbursement contract structure, this can be very, very harrowing for your not-for-profit because you are seeking reimbursement, which means payment for services already rendered. So you have paid the paychecks, ideally, of your employees providing those services. You have paid your own suppliers for the goods and supplies needed in the delivery of those services. And so you are bridge loaning, often the federal government, on services for which you have already provided but for which you have not received payment. The other thing that can be very complicated in the accounting process for nonprofits with multiple government agency contracts is that the fiscal year or the contract period of the contract does not necessarily coincide with the organization's fiscal year. So while your organization may keep a calendar fiscal year, the federal agency you're operating with may begin its fiscal year in September. And so they want you to report on the contract using their fiscal period and their reporting periods, not necessarily the one that your agency uses for your GAAP audit. So that can be particularly complicating. Additionally, you may be awarded a 5-year federal contract for $5 million, and in year 3, the administration changes, and the new administration does not place the same priority on that area of service, and you may find out that your subsequent payments have been reduced, and you either need to shrink your program, lay people off, or find a creative way to continue providing the services you thought you were going to be able to provide for 2 more years. So the upside is that government contracts do provide great opportunities for the right organization. Government contracts can bring with them a level of efficiency, and you do find that there are organizations that are 95, 98% government contract funded, and those organizations are just professionally staffed and geared toward that funding model, and they are able to bridge the delays in reimbursement. They are familiar with lines of credit and additional financing tools that they might need to take advantage of being, the primary government provider of that service in that region or area. And it is true that significant benefits to our communities can be provided when nonprofits and government agencies partner. Even more interesting are sort of the growing trifecta of relationships that bring in a government funder, a private funder, and one or a coalition of nonprofits to provide necessary services. So for all of the frustrations that I voice and for all of the complications that I note, government funding is not going away, and the social condition in this country would not be served if nonprofits did not strive to find effective ways to work with the government to provide for the benefits of its people. But I like to caution both my clients and my students to go into the process of seeking government support with their eyes open and not with the belief that, if we can just secure that contract, we'll be home free. I very rarely have found an organization that has secured even significant multi-year government contracts at the end of the period considers itself to have made out like a bandit or that contract made their life easier. They are repeatedly noting that they either under budgeted or overestimated the returns that they would receive from that engagement. So that's the goal here is for you to go on in with your eyes open and make a realistic choice about whether or not government funding is a viable component to your funding strategy for your nonprofit or your issue.